All right, Module 2C, or Lecture 3, however you want to think about it. I will admit every now and then you'll probably catch me with an espresso as I'm doing my lectures. Keeps me kind of going through great. I hope you have one as well. Alrighty. Looming ancients, I've called this. The textbook refers to these people as touchstones. Basically, the idea here is there are some people from the far, far past who were thinkers ahead of their time to some extent, who posited ideas or theories or perspectives that continue to be very powerful notions in psychology today. And so we want to kind of, do the respect of acknowledging their contribution. And again, we will see it reemerge as we go all the way through. So excellent. Module 2C, Looming Ancients. Let's jump on right in. Okay. I will say at the beginning, at times there will feel like, for you guys, this course will feel a little bit like a laundry list where I'm talking to you about, okay, here's person one, here's what they did. Here's person two, here's what they did. It's hard to avoid a little bit, but I'll try to kind of bring these people to life a little bit more and show you how they're connected as we start to learn more and more about these characters. So we're going to start with Pythagoras, and Pythagoras is a fascinating character in history. He was revered by many. He was seen as a spiritual leader in some cases. He was, by the way, a vegetarian, and all of his followers were vegetarians. They believed that was the right way to be. I believe that as well. So, a very powerful, mystical kind of figure that's had this enduring effect on especially mathematics, but really science and the connection of science to mathematics. He's really the one. So, let's just start right here. Mathematics and music. Let's jump to this. Quick little video. With some sort of ad that I will ignore in just a second. Okay. Okay, so this is a longer, and we're not going to watch all of this. Or is it? No, actually this is relatively 4 minutes. We will watch this.
It may sound like a paradox or some cruel joke, but whatever it is, it's true. Beethoven, the composer of some of the most celebrated music in history, spent most of his career going deaf. So how was he still able to create such intricate and moving compositions? The answer lies in the patterns hidden beneath the beautiful sounds. Let's take a look at the famous Moonlight Sonata, which opens with a slow, steady stream of notes grouped into triplets. 1 and 2 and 3 and But though they sound deceptively simple, each triplet contains an elegant melodic structure, revealing the fascinating relationship between music and math. Beethoven once said, "I always have a picture in my mind when composing, and follow its lines." Similarly, we can picture a standard piano octave consisting of 13 keys, each separated by a half step. A standard
Okay, so I'm not going to do the whole detail of this, but I just think this combination, or this, music and math, we think of music as the ultimate subjective kind of thing, right? It stirs our soul. It can give us peace. It can make us sad. It can make us happy. It can, it has this, real power over us. And, what Pythagoras was struck by is this powerful stimulus of the world that has such spiritual significance to us is essentially math. Underlying everything, all of the melodies that sound nice to us, they sound nice because they follow specific mathematical rules. And if you violate those mathematical rules, at least if you do it a lot, then the music starts to sound bad, discordant. The things don't go together. They only go together when everything follows some nice math rules. Now, to you musicians out there, let me say, occasionally musicians will use discordance. They will have a part of a song where they insert a note that doesn't fit. And they do that on purpose because it makes us all kind of perk up and go, what the? And then they almost immediately follow it with a note that does fit. And that makes us go, ah. Okay, so it is true that some musical composers use discordance as a tool, but for the most part, music follows nice mathematical relations. And so this was the kind of thing that Pythagoras was known for, saying things in the world that we see and think about can be broken down to mathematics. And in fact, the truth of the thing may be in the mathematics. And so he is critical. I'm going to talk on some of these other issues, but on this first one, he is critical for really associating math with a closer to objective truth. And as we see scientists in the future who are using math as a core way to kind of capture some phenomenon, and we now think of science as equations, right? E equals mc squared and stuff like that. When you can break it down to a mathematical equation, the sense is you got to the reality of it. That is the underlying structure of the reality. And he's really started scientists with this preoccupation with math as a way of representing what they do. Okay, so that's really Pythagoras, and we'll come back to that in a second. But let me move to a different kind of notion. He was also big on this notion of opposites and the balancing of opposites. Light and dark, cold and warm, whatever you may want to think of as extremes. He often said, when you have those extremes in balance, then you reach harmony or unity. He would talk about it as, and the struggle of life came from trying to find this harmony. When things are out of balance, he described it as chaos. And by the way, I know some of you are interested in Jordan Peterson's ideas, and he talks a lot about chaos, the chaos of life, and sort of taming it. That's from Pythagoras, is where he's sort of come up with a lot of those ideas. And so Pythagoras would say we're constantly being pulled in different directions, and we're trying to find ways of. So, for example, let me give you one. We all want to be individuals, but we also want to fit into groups. So we simultaneously want to be like other people. That makes us kind of fit with them, but be unique from them. And so we have these two sort of poles to be like them, but different from them. And if we can find the right balance of those two things, we can reach harmony, a point where we feel comfortable with who we are while still being able to connect well with our friends. And so this notion of looking at poles, looking at opposites, and bringing them into balance and various other things, we're going to see that all through psychological ideas. So his focus on these opposites and trying to get them into harmony or unity, you'll see will become a very common theme now and then. Now here's a part I'm going to admit, before last fall, I knew only the history of psychology. I knew was only that which I taught in Intro Psych, which was 3 lectures. And so as I taught this last fall, there are times in the textbook when I find the concepts challenging. This last one is one of them. This distinction Pythagoras makes between the limited and the unlimited. And so he talked about, and here's the example they give in the textbook, which I think I kind of can work with or not. Except the author's kind of loose with it, so I don't really like how he does it. But he talks about snow, and that snow can seem unlimited. He then says, when I'm shoveling it, it seems unlimited. So I don't like that because it sounds like he's talking about the amount of snow sounds unlimited. I think what he should have said is more the following. When you look at every snowflake, it looks like each one is unique, right? No two snowflakes are alike, we will say. But when you actually zoom in on it, you see that the structure, the crystalline structure of a snowflake is following mathematical rules. And so while those rules may play out differently and create an unlimited number of snowflakes, those snowflakes are generated by a very limited set of mathematical principles. And so this combination of these mathematical principles that give rise to all these very specific things is everything we see. Although, the textbook is confusing to me on this one too. It will say things like the limited plus the unlimited is everything in our reality. But then we only perceive the limited. See, that's where I'm kind of confused now, because we can perceive the differences of snowflakes. So I'm just going to tell you, this one confuses me. And maybe in office hours or something like that, if somebody feels like they have a bigger sense of limited and unlimited, I would love to learn from you. I would love to, maybe you've had this in another course and you think you can discuss it. Let's talk about it in office hours. You will find, those of you, when you read it in the textbook, it's a little confusing. Just know when things are confusing in the textbook, we will test you on the way they're presented in the textbook. So, as long as you know what's said there, you're okay. But if you're like me, you want to really understand. And so that's why I'm inviting somebody to come in office hours and help me with limited, unlimited. I'd appreciate that. Okay. Let's just dive into the mathematics side a little bit, because this is really where Pythagoras is going to have the main power. So I'll just say there's order. This is what Pythagoras, he looked at the world of, a bunch of different objects and a bunch of different things, and he saw math when he looked at the world. And so he said there's an order to the universe, and numbers are critical to kind of capturing that order, to learning about it. And so when we can capture it, and the order in math, that tells us we understand something. So of course Pythagoras is known for his Pythagorean theorem, as we see here. So if you have a right angle triangle, then we can talk about the hypotenuse, which is always opposite, right? So C would be the hypotenuse, the side opposite the right angle. And we know, and so, Pythagoras was the one that discovered it. He went out and measured these things, and he found out that, the length of this always equals, the length of this squared always equals the length of this squared plus the length of this squared. And so he just noticed this is true. This is order. When you have a right angle triangle, this is always true. But when he stated it like that, suddenly this is the equation now, right? It's an equation where he says, this is a reality of the universe, and I've captured it in math. And that made people, it felt like undeniable. It felt objective, right? You can go out and measure things and you will find this is always true. So it seems like he got at a core truth of, in this case, geometry, right? And how the sides of things work in an ordered universe. This is going to be his main legacy to the history of science, is this quest that now many other scientists have gone on, and psychologists also. Get on and off this bandwagon a little bit. I mean, obviously we use stats, we use math, but that's more as a tool. This is more like a theory, right? When you can boil down the behavior of something or the reality of something to a mathematical formula, that means you really understand what's going on. Okay, that concept is going to loom large, and that's Pythagoras. Okay, so let's move a little bit to Plato. So Plato also, he was a big thinker, obviously, considered all sorts of issues, and brought up a couple of things that continue to be with us all through psychology today. So the first thing is he spoke a lot about innate knowledge. He kind of suggested that all of us, and this is going to be a concept that'll come up every now and then. Jung will have some of this in his work. So it's kind of like, okay, we're born, and yes, we're interacting with the world and we're learning things, but behind, somewhere in the back of our mind, and he connects this to the soul, there is part of us that has all this knowledge about the world from the moment we're born. That's the innate knowledge. So he kind of imagines like every human being has somehow got a connection to the storehouse of knowledge of the world. And they just have this available to them. They often can't see it directly, but it's kind of there somewhere. So, in raising this issue, and you're going to see how it plays out in a couple of situations, but in raising this issue, he was the first to kind of really get at this nature-nurture distinction, where the idea is, we're born with some things, perhaps, and that's our nature. So there's some things at birth that we kind of come with. But then there are other things we develop as we interact with the world. That's the nurture part, right? So, for example, when we get into a lot of genetics and things like that, that really pushed the nature side of things. How much is your intelligence did you inherit from your parents? If your parents are more intelligent, will you tend to be more intelligent? And what if they're not as intelligent? Do you tend to not be as intelligent? Is your intelligence somehow inherited in part from your parents? People say yes, part of it is. That's the nature part. But can you also enhance your intelligence by, say, going to school and learning things? Yes, that's the nurture part. Okay, so we have this distinction between what you're born with and what you acquire in life. Nature versus nurture. And, that continues to be a critical issue in almost everything we do today. So Plato kind of lifted that. He also had this notion of perfect forms. Many of you guys probably know his cave analogy, where he would say things like, imagine there are some things and you have a candle and you can't actually see the things, but there's a candle that projects a shadow of those things onto a wall. And that's what we actually see. So he said the reality we see is like those shadows of things on the wall. But behind every one of those things is a perfect form of it. And so if you think of like, you see some dog out there, and maybe you see a bunch of different dogs, and it's kind of like, those are all imperfect versions of some perfect dog that exists, that you can't see it, but it's there. There's notions like this that will come from Gestalt psychology, that we will generate what we will call stereotypes, literally. We can even think of this literally with say, dogs. You've seen 15, 20, 30 different dogs. In the perception area, there is this notion that as you see all those dogs, you're constantly creating an average dog, a stereotypical dog that, all of these things kind of inform. But if there's something that just about every dog has, let's say 4 legs, then you see that stereotypical dog as having 4 legs. But if there's something where they vary like color, or what their coat actually looks like, well, now you end up with some sort of average in your perfect form of all those things. I'm going to come back to the perfect form, so I'll give you a sense. But it's a big part of things like Gestalt psychology, where the idea is that perfect form informs your perception. It actually biases. You want to perceive things like they're the perfect forms and other things like that. Okay, so that idea has kind of hung around. And then there's those annoying irrational numbers. All right, so irrational numbers are a fascinating little part of the history of science in general. As Pythagoras got people so interested in numbers, people started playing with all these numbers in a variety of ways, and at some point they ran into something odd: irrational numbers. Here's, I think, where the issue actually began. Pythagoras made geometry cool, at least to some people, and so people started measuring things, just like Pythagoras had measured triangles and found something cool about it. People would measure other things, and one of the things they found is if they looked at a circle and they could quantify its area, they could literally measure how much is in the middle. They knew its diameter, and what they found as they were applying math and trying to get to the truth is that this area always equaled the diameter squared multiplied by, this weird thing, and specifically this weird thing, that when you can sort of do this backwards, right? So instead of multiplying by diameter squared, you can divide each side by that, so area over diameter squared, and then you could actually do 4 times that, and when you do that, you end up with this number pi. And so this number pi, this is just sort of another way of doing it where you can get it down to, this is based on the circumference now, so you could use the circumference instead of the area. But if you again play with the circumference and the diameter, you notice that for every circle, the diameter equals the circumference over pi. Or another way of saying it is pi. If you kind of flip this around, multiply both sides by pi, and then divide both sides by diameter, we'd have pi equals the circumference over the diameter. So if you take a circle, any circle, perfect circle, you measure its circumference, you measure its diameter, you divide the circumference by the diameter, you get this 3.141, blah, 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 blah. Why is it irrational? Irrational actually means no ratio. It means you cannot capture the number like with just a simple ratio. So you can with 1.5, you can say it's the same as 3 over 2. but 3.14159, continue. There's no ratio. I mean, there's this ratio, C over D, circumference over diameter, but that's not, those are both just variables. Those are not actual numbers. And so people started to get really curious about these numbers. Like pi seems to be an important number in nature, right? It's connected to things like circles. Is there some mystical? And so science actually kind of went a little mystical at this point, where people thought, is there some? So they became very interested in these irrational numbers. What do they mean? Do they have some special significance? And there's another one that really started to kind of grab people, and it's called the golden ratio. So I'm going to show you this video, and then I'm going to kind of poo-poo it a little bit, but let's just show it, and let's enjoy the enthusiasm of the presenter first, and then we'll go from there.
When I learned about this math ratio, it changed my life. Okay, so I'm going to explain in this video a math and design phenomena called the golden ratio. It's also referred to as phi. So what is the golden ratio? Well, to help explain it, I'm going to put out this sequence of numbers called the Fibonacci sequence, which is really just the golden ratio in a sequenced numeric form. Now, to arrive at this golden ratio sequence of numbers, we just need to follow a basic math formula. And I'm not a math person, so we're just going to keep this very simple. Okay, so you just start with 0 plus 1 equals 1. And now to get to the next number in the sequence, you take the sum of that simple equation and add it to the last number in the equation. So 1 plus 1 equals 2, and then 1 plus 2 equals 3. And it's around this point that the ratio actually starts showing up. And as we continue to do this formula, we start arriving at a set of numbers. So 2, 3, 5, 8, and you see what we're doing? We're adding the sum of the equation to the last number in the equation, and we arrive at this sequence of numbers. And it's interesting that this sequence and ratio actually remains consistent no matter how long you follow this mathematical formula. And so this sequence continues to expand outward around the rate and the ratio of 1 to 1.6. Now, to help give you an idea of what a 1 to 1.6 ratio is, compare it to a 1 to 1 ratio. So to make a 1 to 1.6 ratio, you just envision a little more than half of the initial line added to the line of the other side. All right, so this ratio of 1 to 1.6, and this is the ratio that's called the golden ratio, a 1 to 1.6 ratio. So this is what the golden ratio looks like as a rectangle, 1 to 1.6. And if we were to start making incremental golden ratio points within that, we can get an idea of what a spiral looks like when it expands outward at the same measured sequence. Now, this is all well and good, but what does that have to do with everyday life? Well, a lot actually. And that's because when we look to nature, we see that so many things flourish when they go to the golden ratio design and when they follow this sequence. Growing and expanding to the rate of the golden ratio spiral allows the maximum amount of rain to be directed down to the roots of many plants. And remarkably, when you study nature, you see the golden Fibonacci numbers like 3, 5, 8, 13, all of that again and again in the seed pattern spirals of plants, as well as in the number of petals. Next time you're bored and have a sunflower, try counting the number of seeds in the sunflower spiral, the golden ratio. Or maybe try something else with a spiral, like a pine cone or pineapple. So we could spend all day counting the seeds of flowers and plants and fruit. I mean, you get the idea. But we don't just see this golden ratio sequence on a small scale. This ratio is the mathematical sequence in the spirals of our storms, tornadoes, hurricanes. These all spin in this golden sequence, 1 to 1.6. Even the waves can be measured using this ratio. But it doesn't stop there. Modern technology continues to be mystified by the far-reaching scope of the golden ratio, from the alignment of the planets to the spirals of our Milky Way galaxy, as well as the spirals of other ratios in planets. Now let's take this closer to home. I want you to hold out your arm and look at the distance between your shoulder and your elbow, and then from your elbow to your fingertips. Notice how your elbow, from your shoulder to your elbow is 1, and then from your elbow to your fingertips is 1.6. Pretty crazy, huh? But it doesn't stop there. Now take that further. The distance from your fingertips to your wrist is 1, and from your wrist to your elbow is 1.6. Keep it going. From the furthest tip of your finger to the bottom of your fingers is 1, and from the bottom of your fingers to your wrist is 1.6.
All right, I'm gonna let you guys watch the rest of that if you like. But the first thing I want to point out is there is a coolness to it. Okay, so that 1.1 or 1.6 she said, notice that it isn't actually 1.6, right? It was that repeating. It was like the pi, right? It was another irrational number. But yeah, just like people measuring pyramids, people started to measure stuff in nature, and they kept finding this number. Now, some people are super impressed by it. She was obviously super impressed by it. Other people are like, yeah, give me any number. This is the counter argument. Give me any number. Give me 1.8. And I will go out into nature, and I bet I can find some stuff that follows that 1 to 1.8. Or 1 to 2. I mean, even as she was showing her arm, it was like 1 to 1.8, but then she used this part again against that as the longer part, so it wasn't like our hands are now 1.8 or 1.6 times our forearms. So when people look for these things, they sometimes take some liberties. You might have even seen it with the spiral of the Milky Way. It's kind of like, well, it wasn't really that. You've kind of done that twice and made it fit. But so some people are like, yeah, I don't know. I think somebody's found this number somewhere, and they go looking for it everywhere, and they can see other examples. But other people think, no, there's really something to it. And this is again that connection to the mystical. Of the idea that this is such, like when she said things like, this brings the most water to the roots if the leaves follow this pattern. That suggests a beauty and an elegance and an order to nature. And so that's really what I want you to take from this, that post Pythagoras, with the Pythagoras kind of pointing at numbers can capture the order of the universe, but then others kind of, especially with the irrational numbers, saying, yeah, and they might be even special. There may be some special numbers out there that have real kind of mojo of some sort. I wondered, she showed, for example, all these flowers that have a number of leaves that go along with that Fibonacci sequence. Could we not go out into nature and find flowers with leaves that don't have one of those numbers? I have to believe that you could. I mean, there's the 4-leaf clover, but of course the 4-leaf clover is known as an exception of a sort, right? Do other things have 4 leaves? Because 4 is not in the Fibonacci sequence, or 6 leaves, etc. So are they selectively looking for stuff that fits with what they want to say, which is always a danger, sort of confirmation bias once again, that fits in there. But again, the bigger point is, people were getting jazzed by numbers, and numbers were being connected to the order of the universe. And there was this implicit notion going on that is the ultimate goal of science. If you're trying to explain the universe, then you want to get it down to a formula. And if you can get it down to a formula or numbers, you're really getting at the core of what's going on. Okay, cool. So let's take that from there. I want to just sort of bring this back to you, because it kind of it sneaks on. Let me back up a little bit here and just say, when we get back to this perfect forms, the notion of perfect forms that Plato pushed, I just want to show you one way this plays out in modern psychology. So when it comes to the notion of attractiveness, is somebody attractive or not? And we'll say, well, that's a subjective phenomenon. What one person finds attractive, another person may not. Well, it's kind of not true. There does seem to be some order to attractiveness. And we can almost guess how attractive you'll find somebody based on things like symmetry of facial features. So let me go there, but let me just explain to you what you're looking at here. These are women. Well, these women don't exist. The woman you see here does not exist. Each image here was taken by averaging many different women who come from, for example, in this case, the Uzbek, the country, that part of the world. And so we find Uzbeki, I guess they're called, as many Uzbeki or Uzbekian women as we can. We take pictures of their faces, and then we morph all of those pictures together to give us the average face. And this is the same thing done for Welsh women, West African women, Vietnamese women, etc. And what we know from these faces is if you show these faces to people, these averages of a bunch of different faces, they tend to be viewed as attractive. Okay, and so just take a look, as you go through, and the idea is most of these women you would say are beautiful, are attractive women. There's huge differences, obviously. I mean, you also see interesting differences, say, between Central Africa and West Africa. Not that far apart geographically, but you can see, a wider face here, but still beautiful, right? Just a different overall sort of bone structure that's common. But again, once we average all the individuals, we end up with very attractive faces. Choose your culture. This is not just true of women, it's true of men as well. So this is the same idea. Men's faces average together. Why do we like average faces? We kind of think we like exotic faces or somebody that's got some interesting characteristic. Not so. We like things like symmetry. So when you average these faces, you end up with relatively symmetrical faces. The ears are at the same level on both sides. The eyes tend to be at the same level. Eyebrows are roughly similar. Facial structure similar on both sides. When you average together, you get a lot of symmetry across the face. But any of our individual faces have a lot of differences around. In fact, one really cool thing to do, if you ever get the time, I should do this for me. Take a picture of yourself, cut it down the middle, and then create a version of you that's your left side, but then just reverse it and stick it together. So you have two left sides kind of stuck together and two right sides stuck together. What you will see is that your face looks very different on the left side than on the right side. It's almost like two different people. We are all asymmetrical. But the more symmetrical you are, the more attractive you are. So this is kind of like Plato's perfect forms, right? He would say none of these individuals and none of these individuals really exist. They are derived, they are the perfect form derived from averaging a bunch of imperfect forms. But that perfect form is beautiful. So this is just, to kind of show you how some of these things play out in modern psychology when we're trying to understand things like attractiveness, and how a mathematics, the average face, seems to relate to something, even something so human as who you find attractive as an individual. Okay, so that's really the story of this lecture. Oops, sorry, I didn't mean to. No, actually, I'm not quite done yet, because I just want to acknowledge something at the end. But the first big story of this lecture is math. Thanks to Pythagoras and others, there is this notion that math is good science. And this is going to be a challenge for psychology in some contexts. Okay, so just before leaving this, we talked a lot about the sort of Pythagoras and Plato, Western kind of philosophy, and we're going to do a little bit more of that. But we do want to also acknowledge that there's a big Eastern tradition as well. A lot of the Eastern and Middle Eastern works were lost in the Great Fire in Egypt. And so we don't know as much as we should, which is sometimes why we neglect, or seemingly neglect, more ancient than Aristotle, Plato. A lot of that work was lost. So yeah, that's all there's to it. So we only know so much, but a couple of individuals, for example, to give you a sense of their relation to psychology is, let's start with Confucius. So Confucius was really focused in his teachings on social and moral order. So he didn't focus so much on the natural world. He was kind of like not a physicist. He was more really interested in the human world, the social world that humans created, and the moral world about how to kind of justly, I don't know if that's the right word, appropriately interact in this social world, which is our sense of morals, right? And so in a way, he was pushing psychology in the earlier days, or much more focused on the human part of our natural existence, etc. He also tended to be very directive. What do we think of for Confucius? Confucius say, and what Confucius say is what you should do. And so he ultimately would commonly, direct followers. This is what you should do. This is what you should do. And we call that now a directive style. And it will come up in psychology in therapy. We'll see that some therapies are what we call directive, where ultimately the therapist interacts with the patient and then says, this is what you should do. Other therapies are less directive, where the actual patient, who we usually wouldn't even call a patient in a non-directive, we'd call them a client. The client is a big part of deciding which direction they go. And the therapist is more of a guide, more of a sounding board almost. So, some of that starts with Confucius, where we see that contrast of directive and non-directive styles. Also Lao Tzu, very famous, very interesting character in many different ways. But he, almost in contrast to Confucius, saw natural and social orders as interconnected and continuous. So the human existence was not distinct from the natural existence per se. It's an extension of it. It's an inclusion of it. It's connected to it. We are all really interconnected. And so that was his kind of notion. And so we have a little bit of a contrast there about how much humans are something special or different, or how much it's just a reflection of the natural order as it is. It is a more receptive appreciation of observation and reflection as well. And so we do a lot of observation and reflection in science. And so he kind of held that tradition. Okay, so I'm going to end this section on the ancients here, and I'm going to continue with one more video in this first module, and I will see you there. Okay, bye-bye.